One of the key highlights of the Defense Department's recent memo on multi-factor authentication for unclassified and secret networks is the clarification that DoD Public Key Infrastructure, not the Common Access Card itself, is the department's primary authenticator. Previous policies would often go back and forth between describing the CAC or PKI as DoD's primary credential, creating confusion. Plus, the memo finally introduces passwordless authentication methods designed to give service members faster, more flexible access to systems. For more detail, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Alex Antrim and Adam Oliver, Senior Solutions Engineers at Yubico.
The thing we noticed right away in reading it is the first thing they did is really clarify that DoD PKI was the primary authenticator across DoD. If you've ever glanced across previous policies, they really kind of bounce back and forth between DoD PKI or the CAC specifically when it comes to NIPR. And as any vendor who wanted to get into the PKI space with some kind of alternative form factor, they could go through all the troubles of getting it technically done, working with the proper teams to actually provision a credential. But then you could come along to an organization and say, here's the approval for PKI on our device. And they would probably throw at you a multitude of memos that said, well, it's the CAC. CAC is primary. And we've heard that, of course, along with anybody else who does hardware PKI tokens, I'm sure. And this memo right off the bat clarified that as PKI, which is the actual authentication credential, not what it's stored on, which would be the CAC or the token. And as you read further through the memo, it's also very clear that DoD doesn't plan on moving away from that as the primary credential anytime soon. In any use case where they're talking about CAC holders, where an employee actually holds a CAC, they clarify that if PKI is available, that is what you use, full stop. The next thing that was nice was they finally did approve FIDO2 passkeys. So previously they approved FIDO U2F. So the flow of username, password, and having an authenticator that you would tap as your second factor was what was approved. And now everyone's been talking about how do we get to passwordless, which would be passkeys, where you don't have to remember that password at all, and you can take it out of play. So now that's finally being approved within the memo. Now, unsurprisingly, DoD did not just approve passkeys in general. So it's not a bring your own authenticator type approval. They still say a passkey with a specific technology. So vendors will still need to come in, find an organization that's going to want to get it approved and go through the processes to find that memo to get it onto the list. But now that door is open. Previously, if you brought up FIDO within DoD, the reactions would be varied. You get some people that were very excited about it as a newer modern authentication method. It's also based on cryptography. But then you'd hit people that would go, no. PKI is the gold standard, period. We would never look at anything else. And the memo in those scenarios does really define if a CAC holder gets a FIDO2 credential, how do you bind that to that identity and make sure that the FIDO credential is deactivated based on certain things happening with the certificate, such as it expiring or being revoked. So it's very clear that while there are a great set of alternative ways of authenticating that help reduce the issue of relying on username and password only, DoD is very specific about for CAC holders, you are still tied to your DoD identity and the PKI credential associated with that. And we always, when we go in meetings with customers, we talk about use cases because people will always go, I have a CAC. Why would I want something else? Why do I want another form factor? So we talk about things like, do you have your CAC reader with you if you're using your personal laptop or a personal PC? Did you forget it? Are you using something like a MacBook where you would have one integrated so you had to carry it around? Did it break? Did you lose it? Did you source it from a reputable source? Or is there a problem with the reader? Is there malware on the reader itself? So we talk about these alternative form factors of you don't need that extra device, especially if you have, say, your personal phone. If you've ever used a CAC sled with a personal phone, they're usually nothing but headaches, especially if they're Bluetooth-based. So now DoD has taken these use cases that they've developed and fully listed them out. And every time in the past, we heard someone say, well, X is not authorized for my specific use case. Now you can go to this list and go, are you sure? Because your use case falls into one of these buckets, if it's not PKI. So that helps all those authorizing officials say, well, I want to map options to specific use cases. And now they know what they can approve. They don't have to try to guess and say, well, how do I follow 3 or 4 different memos to get to an approved authentication type with my actual use case? It's pretty much all defined out in one memo.
I just want to add on, Anastasia, from my perspective, one of the better parts of the memo was what Adam was just referring to is that those tables, right? A clear list of tables that have use cases, personas, possibly even a scenario to help organizations within the DoD clearly identify a non-PKI alternative for their environment, for their use case, for the people that need to get access. And that has always been a challenge in the past where organizations were looking to innovate and they could not get that clarity out of existing policies. And for myself, as a 24-year retired senior chief, I know the value of these types of authenticators. The common access card has been an ID card first, and then it moved to authentication. But it is cumbersome. It's something I have to keep hold of. I can't lose it. It is very challenging to get a new one. And with these new alternative authenticators listed in this new memo, it gives many more options to organizations that are looking to provide easier ways for service members, warfighters, et cetera, to get access to critical mission data, whether you're getting gas or you're overseas in a jungle. And these options, these new technologies are critical for getting the warfighters' mission data faster.
Adams, I'm going to go to your very first point that you made, which is about them clarifying the primary credential. Why were they going back and forth between the CAC and PKI, and what issues has that caused?
I think mainly the going back and forth was just probably preference of who wrote the memo or maybe what they read when they wrote their memo. So a lot of branches will put out a memo based on a DoD memo, and theirs may stick around for longer if DoD updates guidance. So it depends on personal preference. And the concern was always for us as a vendor, when they say CAC, that kind of excludes anything other than that card stock, that ID that Alex mentioned. Whereas if they say DoD PKI, any token that is approved by DoD to hold that PKI credential could be leveraged in these other scenarios. So now when you're looking at, I need to log into a device that it's not easy to use a CAC reader with. And in those scenarios, we had to rely on terminology such as the CAC was not feasible nor practical in that scenario, because that's how you saw things pop up in some of these memos. When really what they were kind of trying to get around to, I believe, was when PKI was not feasible nor practical, which is where this new memo came into play. And all those scenarios, those use cases and those approved authentication methods are there because it's been determined that in those scenarios, PKI is not really feasible or can't be used. So they need to provide those other options because everyone knows username and password is just bad in today's day and age. But other than that, I don't think there was any other specific reason other than someone said, we use a CAC every day to log in. That's the credential. And that was kind of the assumption as they were writing a memo, instead of going to the fact of, well, what is the actual credential sitting on the CAC, on that card stock? It's, PKI credentials of a private key sitting on that card stock paired with a public key that does all the validation of everything the private key does, which coincidentally is actually the same way that FIDO works with passkeys. Private key credential and public key or public certificate that is able to validate what that private key has done.
I'll just add a little bit. I think that this new memo and those conversations that helped with this new memo realize that they need to remove focus off of the hardware, the container, the card stock in this case. That is not the thing that actually provides someone access into. It's the credential that's stored on it. So once that clicked, in those roundtable discussions, they removed focus from the container that holds the credential and put focus on the credential itself, regardless of what container that credential is stored on. And I think that's very, very helpful for this space.
That's Yubico's Alex Antrim and Adam Oliver speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com.